This is the Crime Report with Ron Chinzer, and on today's episode, we're going to get straight into it. Millions of people around the world have now seen the murder of Charlie Kirk. And whether you agreed with him or not, the overwhelming majority of us know the truth. This has no place in any society. Charlie Kirk was more than just a political personality. He was the founder and CEO of Turning Point USA, a voice that stood firmly for American conservative values, a husband since 2021, and a father of two young children. For him, family, faith, and freedom weren't just talking points, they were a part of how he lived. And for that, he did not deserve the injustice carried out against him, nor the pain now borne by his wife, his children, and his loved ones. On September 10th, he was speaking at an event in Utah on a college campus when it happened. A shot rang out. Witnesses saw him collapse as blood poured from his neck. Some screamed. Others ducked for cover. Many froze in horror. Others laughed and celebrated, as disgusting as that is. It was all caught in video, and the world saw it live or on social media. And here's the truth. This is what it looks like when someone is shot. It's not Hollywood, it's not TV drama, it's violent, it's chaotic, it's life-shattering. Newsflash, the next time you hear about an innocent victim of a homicide in Canada from a shooting, sadly, this is what it looks like. This is the reality that families are left with. I say this as someone who spent 20 years in policing. I've seen death, I've investigated shootings, I've stood in blood-stained living rooms, I've shared in the grief of parents, spouses, even children, when I had to knock on their doors and tell them that their loved ones were murdered. I can tell you, it never leaves you. It scars families forever, and it scars the people who have to deliver that news. Now, add to the horror of Charlie Kirk's murder the reality of how some people reacted. Teachers, academics, social workers, journalists, even here in Canada, celebrated. They mocked, they danced on his grave because they disagreed with his politics. Two teachers in Massachusetts are already suspended. A student leader at Oxford has been condemned for his celebratory posts. An MSNBC analyst was fired after downplaying the murder. And here at home, Canadians who posted gleeful comments about his death may not yet have faced consequences, but they've revealed who they really are. The lowest of the low in society. Because celebrating a murder, celebrating the death of a father and a husband, simply because you didn't share his views, especially when you've propped up yourself as someone advocating for global peace and the end of suffering, that's not democracy, that's not freedom, that's not justice, that's hate, that's ignorance, and that's hypocrisy. And Canadians should pay attention, because political violence doesn't stop at the border. What happened in Utah could happen here. We've already seen politicians threatened in their homes, candidates attacked on a campaign trail, and communities divided by rhetoric that gets uglier and uglier every year. Our justice system here at home, it's already crippled by weak bail laws, and repeat violent offenders cycling in and out of custody only makes us more vulnerable. If we shrug this off as their problem, we're lying to ourselves. We must move past saying enough is enough. It's time to actually see those in positions of authority act. Not tomorrow, not next month, but right now. May Charlie Kirk rest in peace. May justice be served swiftly and fully, and may Canada wake up before we find ourselves living through this same nightmare. If that's the cost of looking the other way on violence, here's what it looks like when the courts here in Canada look the other way on guns. If a man under a weapons ban keeps a loaded Glock with 2 extended magazines and more than 200 rounds beside the laundry, then walks out of the court with barely 17 months, what does that say to the families living here in Canada with gunfire outside of their windows? For this story, we're back in Toronto, tracking the case of Mohamed Riahi, 28 years old. Police had been looking for him since 2019 after a shooting near Lawrence and Dufferin, when the Emergency Task Force, which is the SWAT officers, finally hit a North York apartment on Singer Court in June of 2022. They found a Glock 27 Gen 5, a prohibited handgun, loaded with 1 in the chamber ready to go, plus 2 24-round extended magazines and about 210 rounds of ammunition. Riahi was already under a court-ordered prohibition for weapons from an earlier conviction, including drug trafficking and dangerous driving in 2018. That's not a paperwork slip, that's a direct, knowing breach of a ban meant to protect the public. Now, prosecutors also laid trafficking counts after officers seized several small quantities of fentanyl, carfentanil, cocaine, crystal meth, heroin, oxycodone, and hydromorphine that same day of his arrest. Now, those drug charges didn't stick in court. The gun and ammo did. Attempted murder charges tied to the 2019 shooting incident were also withdrawn. Now, the trial judge here, Justice Sandra Nishikawa, convicted him for possessing the prohibited loaded handgun with ammunition while under a ban. Now here's where the sentence shrank. The defense argued charter breaches during the takedown. An ETF officer stomped on Rahai's head, splitting his lip, requiring stitches, and an unlawful backpack search. Now, the judge agreed those were violations, but declined to throw out the gun evidence. Even so, she discounted time for the charter breach and then discounted more for harsh conditions at Toronto South Detention Centre, which multiple reports and decisions have called deplorable, with overcrowding, frequent lockdowns, and prisoners sleeping on the floor. Now, I know corrections officers, and for years they've been telling me that the prisoners know what to do and to say to get their sentence reduced, and in some cases they're voluntarily sleeping on the floor to reduce their sentence. Now, if you've worked in or around the Toronto South Detention Centre, none of that should surprise you. Add another major credit, an impact of race and culture assessment, IRCA, that documented anti-black racism in his life, the violence in his community growing up, and how that shaped his fear and distrust of police. Now, Ontario courts do use the IRCA reports at sentencing to understand the background and the pathways that lead people into the system. Similar in the concept of the Gladue report, an appellate court that sets it out for judges. Now, they can consider these reports, and in this case here, the judge found systemic anti-black racism reduced his moral blameworthiness and pointed toward rehabilitation. That analysis isn't new. It's built on cases like R versus Morris from 2021 and later guidance from courts. So here's the bottom line. The judge started at 4 years, then subtracted over a year for pre-sentence custody, took off more for the charter violation and the Toronto South conditions, and applied an additional reduction for the IRCA report findings, landing at 17 months total. 14 months for the gun, 3 for the breach of the weapons ban. Now, with standard remission, what that actually can look like is well under 6 months of actual served time. So let's talk about the victims of this, because in gun possession case, the victim is often the community we all expect to be safe. The people who hear shots outside their kids' bedrooms, the families who avoid their balconies, the small businesses that close early because repeat offenders carry guns despite court orders. When someone already banned from a weapon is found with a loaded, prohibited handgun and extended magazines, the community expects a sentence that deters, incapacitates, and signals zero tolerance, especially after years of risking fear and headlines that make people feel like they're on their own. Now, here's the tension the public feels. We keep hearing that gun crime is serious, but we also keep seeing deep discounts in court for poor jail conditions, for charter breaches, and for social context of the accused that explains a life story but doesn't erase the danger walking around with a loaded prohibited Glock. Now, people see that and they think the system bends over backwards for the accused while the neighborhood lives with the risk. And when you layer this on top of Canada's broader bail and sentencing debate since Bill C-75 in 2019, it feeds that narrative. Fair or not, the system favors offenders over public safety. That's the actual conversation Canadians are having at coffee shops, not just in the courtroom. So where does that leave us right now? Accountability has to be real. Respect charter rights, fix the jails, absolutely yes. But don't water down the message that carrying a loaded, prohibited handgun, under a ban, by the way, is a hard line. If we keep treating the community impact as theoretical, we'll keep losing trust where it matters most, on the blocks where moms and dads put their kids to bed and hope the night stays quiet. We're told gun crime is serious, yet sentences shrink. And while they shrink, Ottawa spends billions going after licensed owners and cuts the RCMP funding. Now let's lay that one out. Now, this all started when I was provided with confidential information directly from RCMP members. They were frustrated, they were worried, and they are wanting Canadians to know the truth. That tip that officers didn't have vests, didn't have magazines, didn't have their training because it was shut down, and were told that they're going to reduce their public service turned into what's now a national story. Because the federal government is pushing ahead with a multi-billion-dollar firearm confiscation program, while at the very same time cutting the RCMP's budget by $98 million a year. Now think about that. We're told the government is serious about gun crime, yet they've poured billions into a forced seizure program that targets licensed law-abiding owners while starving the very police services tasked with actually protecting Canadians. Now, Tracy Wilson from the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights called the contrast stunning, and she's right. She pointed out the hypocrisy. Billions spent on a gun grab that does nothing to tackle crime, while pulling nearly $100 million out of our RCMP's operating budget every year. Now, internal RCMP emails back that up. Commissioner Mike Duhem confirmed the force has been ordered to cut 2% across the board as part of Ottawa's spending reductions. Now, those cuts will hit programs and frontline capacity, and they're expected to be formalized in the 2026 to 27 estimates coming up in just a few months. Meanwhile, the so-called buyback launched in 2020 is still nowhere near finished. Over 2,500 models of once legal firearms were banned by cabinet orders. Yet 5 years later, they're still sitting locked up in the homes of licensed owners, unused and unusable. The program has been delayed again and again, but Ottawa now says it'll be wrapped up by the end of 2026. The price tag for this, nearly $2 billion. Public Safety Minister Gary Anandasingari has doubled down, insisting this is voluntary. Owners will be forced to surrender their property, though the government promises compensation, which is the buyback. Now, police on the ground say it's a complete waste. Toronto Police Association President Clayton Campbell couldn't have been clearer. He said nearly 90% of the guns seized in Toronto come from the United States, and legal Canadian firearms are almost never used in a crime. His words, "I can't think of a time when a legal gun has been used in a crime in the city, not one. For me, I have the exact same experience." Now, Campbell warned the seizure plan could actually weaken policing capacity, forcing officers to track down thousands of firearms scattered across the country instead of focusing on what they should be doing: violent offenders and border smuggling. He's right. Most of these firearms are unrestricted, which means police don't even know where they are. Despite all of this, the Liberals press on. They say this is a campaign promise Canadians expect to see delivered, but here's the reality. Licensed gun owners are being targeted. Criminals with smuggled handguns and rifles are barely touched, and the RCMP is left scrambling to figure out which programs, which units, and which frontline officers are going to take the hit from those budget cuts. Now, the people who tipped me off knew this would become a national conversation, and it has. Because when you put the facts side by side, the RCMP losing $98 million a year while Ottawa spends billions chasing the legally owned property of Canadians, it exposes a government that looks more interested in headlines than keeping families like yours and mine safe. Now, policy has real-world consequences. In Toronto, the bill came due for a family sleeping at the home. A story well known throughout the country now. Jave Roy, just 8 years old. He was a little boy, just 8 years old again, sleeping with his mom in his bed when a stray bullet tore through the walls of his Toronto home and ended his life. Think about it. He wasn't outside on the street. He wasn't involved in anything. He was in the safest place a child should ever be, in their bed at home. And yet, Jave Roy never woke up again. Police say it happened just after midnight on August 16th, inside a community housing unit near Martha Eaton Way and Terthui Drive, a place I'm very familiar with. Jave was rushed to the hospital after being shot, but the injury was fatal. It's the kind of tragedy that leaves an entire community hollowed out, because if a child isn't safe sleeping under his own roof, then no one feels safe anywhere. Now, let's go to the suspects, because police have charged a 16-year-old with first-degree murder and multiple firearm offenses. Now, because of Canada's Youth Criminal Justice Act, we can't share his name, even though he's accused of one of the most serious and heinous crimes in the criminal code. Now, what we do know is this. When the police arrested him on September 5th, he was carrying a loaded, prohibited handgun. Investigators then executed a search warrant at a Toronto residence and seized more evidence. Now, he appeared in bail court the very next day. Whether he was held or released, the public isn't allowed to know, but I'm willing to bet he's released. Now, police aren't just stopping there. They've also identified 2 other suspects connected to the same murder. Both of them face first-degree murder charges as well. Police took the unusual steps of releasing their names and photos publicly. That's a move that absolutely requires judicial authorization that actually expires on September 12th. Now, it's rare, but it shows just how seriously investigators are treating this case. Now, here's where the public sentiment boils completely over. Families are asking, how is it possible that minors barely in their teens are carrying out illegal guns modified to fire automatically and pulling triggers that destroy innocent lives? Under Bill C-75 and the way the Youth Criminal Justice Act works right now, Canadians have grown used to seeing young offenders shielded, protected, and often recycled right back into the communities in which they victimized. But where's the protection for the children and those who never got a chance to grow up? Where's the justice for parents now forced to bury an 8-year-old who did nothing but go to bed? Toronto's Police Chief Myron Demkew says the investigation is far from over and they need the public's help to track down the remaining suspects. But you can feel it on the streets. People are angry, people are afraid, and people are tired of hearing enough is enough, as I am, when nothing changes. At the center of the story is Jave Roy. He wasn't a statistic, he wasn't just a headline. He was a little boy with a future that was stolen in the middle of the night by monsters. And until we start seeing real accountability for those who pull the trigger, Canadians are going to keep asking whether or not the system cares more about the rights of these monsters than the rights of the victims like Jave Roy. And when a child's name becomes a headline, families don't want sympathy, they want change and they want justice. That's the press conference I was a part of in Woodbridge, Ontario, just a few days ago. When I stood in that press conference this week, I wasn't alone. I brought with me victims of violent crime, people who've lived through the nightmares of losing family members, of surviving attempted murder, of being stabbed in their own homes during home invasions, of watching loved ones taken by repeat violent offenders who should have never been out in the first place. Now, they stood shoulder to shoulder with other families broken by violent crime, with police associations, with advocacy groups, and with politicians. And for once, their voices weren't silenced. They had the chance to tell their stories, and not just to me, but to the country. And it was in that setting that Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre unveiled what he's calling the Jail Not Bail Act. And make no mistake, this wasn't a sterile political announcement. This was framed by the raw emotion of parents, widows, and survivors who've had their lives shattered by crimes that never needed to happen. Poilievre put the blame squarely on the Liberal government and specifically on Bill C-75, which since 2019 has directed judges to release accused offenders at the earliest opportunity under the least onerous conditions. He called it exactly what it feels like in communities across the country, a revolving door, catch and release justice system. Now, the numbers back it up. Since the Liberals came into power, violent crime is up 55%. Sexual assaults are up 76%. Extortion is up 330%. These aren't partisan talking points. Those are Statistics Canada figures. And in families told the same story at the press conferences. Crimes that should have never happened if the system had kept violent repeat offenders where they belonged, in custody. Now, the Jail Not Bail Act, championed by Arpan Khanna, aims to change that. It would repeal the Liberal principle of restraint and make public safety the top priority in bail decisions. It creates a new major offenses category covering crimes like sexual assault, firearms offenses, kidnapping, human trafficking, home invasions, robbery, extortion, and arson, where the onus is flipped and the accused has to prove that they're safe to release. Now, judges would be required to look at a person's entire criminal history before making a bail decision, and repeat offenders would no longer be able to walk out of the courtrooms only to reoffend days later. Now, the legislation also bars anyone with a serious conviction from serving as a guarantor on bail. It requires non-residents accused of major crimes to surrender their passport and sets a 3-strike rule that denies bail, parole, or probation to repeat offenders. On top of that, Poilievre pledged to repeal Liberal laws C-5 and C-75, impose mandatory jail time for intimate partner violence, and ban organized crime gangs like the Bishno gang by designating them as terrorist groups. Poilievre's words were pretty blunt. Crime is raging out of control. All of these crimes were avoidable if the criminals had been kept where they belonged, in jail and not released. He spoke about a young mother, Bailey McCourt, who we've covered in this show, murdered by a man who should have never been free, and about the horrifying case of a 3-year-old child sexually assaulted and raped by a convicted pedophile in Welland, who was released early. These tragedies are avoidable, and that's what's fueling this bill. And I could tell you, standing there beside these victims and survivors, there was nothing abstract about it. This wasn't about politics. It was about real Canadians crying through their words, begging for change, demanding a justice system that protects victims first. Poilievre said it best. This isn't about a hatred for criminals. It's about the love for the victims. And if you were in that room, in that press conference, watching families finally being heard, you would know exactly why that moment matters. The victims are asking for actions, and here's why. A convicted predator was free, and a toddler paid the price in Welland, as we've already discussed in length. And that next story takes us back to St. Catharines, Ontario, where crowds in St. Catharines this week chanted "pedo scum" outside the courthouse. They weren't chanting at rumors. They were there because a convicted sex offender with a long history, Daniel Senecal, is now accused of breaking into a home and violently raping and sexually assaulting a toddler under the age of 3, while the child's parents slept in the same house. Now, Senecal, he's not new to the courts. He was a convicted sex offender, convicted of sexual assault in 2021 and again in 2023. And despite those convictions, he walked free in March of 2024 under conditions that were supposed to protect the public. Instead, by the end of summer, police allege he was back at it, this time targeting a 3-year-old child in their own bed in their own home. Now think about that, a toddler assaulted, raped, sexually assaulted in their sleep by a repeat offender who should have never been released, and he was free to strike again. Now here's where the public's outrage grows even hotter, and this made international news. Sources close to this case say Senecal has been identifying as transgender and has allegedly sought to be transferred into a women's facility. I also received that information. Now on social media, he lists she, her pronouns, but when he appeared in court, both the judge and his counsel referred to him as Sir and Mr. Senecal, and he didn't correct him. Protesters and even corrections insiders believe this isn't about identity, it's about playing the system. Because right now, while in custody, Senecal is being kept in segregation, and under current policies, prolonged time in segregation can be used later by defense counsel to argue for a reduced overall sentencing. If that's the case, then what we're watching isn't just a sexual predator raping children, it's a predator manipulating loopholes and broken corrections policies to try to shave down time behind bars. And this isn't theoretical, it's real. Canada's correctional policy allows inmates to self-declare gender identity and request housing consistent with that identity. We've seen dangerous offenders attempt to use this as leverage to move into women's facilities, where the risk to female inmates is obvious. In Senecal's case, even if the transfer never happens, simply being in segregation linked to his trans claim creates yet another angle his lawyers could exploit to cut his sentence. Now, that's not justice, that's gaming the system. So picture this, a registered sex offender, already convicted twice, walks free, then allegedly assaults a toddler. Now, the public rallied by the hundreds demanding jail, not bail. Yet behind the courthouse walls, the conversations turned into gender identity pronouns and custody placement, while the actual victim, an infant, a toddler, a child, recovers from a nightmare no child should ever live through. Now, Welland's mayor stood outside that courthouse and said what so many Canadians feel. This is about protecting the people who can't protect themselves. But under this government, under these laws, we're protecting the predators instead. Senecal should be facing the harshest sentence this law allows. No loopholes, no games, no segregation credit, no gender identity shields. And the people who gathered outside chanting "protect kids" have it right. Because until our justice system stops bending over backwards for repeat violent offenders, toddlers will keep paying the price while predators like Senecal work the system to their own advantage. And if that doesn't make you sick, then nothing will. Now, one case is a warning. A city in crisis is a siren, and Barrie just pulled the alarm. The state of emergency over encampments. Now, when a mayor has to stand in front of a camera and declare a state of emergency over homeless encampments, you know the situation has spun out of control. And that's exactly what happened this week in Barrie, Ontario, where Mayor Alex Nuttall told residents bluntly, "We are reclaiming our streets, our parks, our schools, and our sense of safety." Now, this isn't about people quietly sleeping in their tents. It's about nearly 24 encampments scattered across the city, set up in playgrounds, along waterways, even near schools where police, firefighters, and paramedics are now responding regularly to for fires, overdoses, thefts, and assaults. Now, one of Barrie's largest encampments turned into a scene of a double homicide and dismemberment earlier this summer. Cleaning it up cost the city millions because of hazardous waste left behind. At another site, water testing in Diamonds Creek showed E. coli levels 5 times higher than the safe limit, forcing bans on swimming. Families in Barrie aren't even imagining the risk. They're living it. Parents no longer feel safe taking their kids to local parks. Residents are watching once quiet neighborhoods turn into hubs of drug trafficking, weapons, and violence. In fact, the mayor spelled it out. Encampments have been used to store crossbows and pistols while doubling down as open-air drug markets. Now, Mayor Nuttall says that the city isn't abandoning people who need help. Shelter spaces and support programs exist for those willing to accept them. But he drew a hard line for those refusing services while bringing danger to public spaces. If you refuse help, you cannot stay in these encampments. If you come to Barrie to put up a tent, use drugs, carry weapons, and deal narcotics, go somewhere else. Now, that declaration of emergency gives city staff new power to dismantle high-risk sites, bring in outside contractors for cleanup, and push the county of Simcoe into the province to expand funding for shelters and addiction treatments. Now, Mayor Nuttall stressed the problem has worsened dramatically since the pandemic, with many unhoused individuals coming from outside Barrie to set up camp in the city. And here's the bigger point that every city is feeling that's experiencing something like this. Communities are hitting a breaking point. Residents feel they're losing control of their public spaces while violent crime and lawlessness are tolerated under the banner of compassion. Barrie's mayor made it clear. Compassion doesn't mean chaos, and empathy doesn't mean turning a blind eye to murder scenes in public parks. Now, the city has now drawn a line. Barrie will help those who want help, but it will no longer let lawlessness replace community safety. And the truth is, many other Canadian cities are watching Barrie closely because that same crisis is playing out everywhere, even in my own community. And communities are drawing hard lines. Now, the police are too. In Edmonton, officers did something almost unheard of. They challenged the Crown prosecution. Now, this is completely rare. It's almost unheard of for a police service to publicly challenge Crown prosecutors. But this week in Edmonton, police did exactly that, and they were right to do it. The case involved the horrific killing of an 8-year-old Indigenous girl in 2023. She disappeared from her home, and later her small body was stuffed in a hockey bag and abandoned in the bed of a pickup truck in a place that I can't even pronounce near Edmonton. Now, police charged her mother with first-degree murder, and that charge should mean the harshest penalty our laws allowed, life with no parole for 25 years. And when I say 25 years, I mean the full 25. But prosecutors have now offered her a deal, downgrading the charge to manslaughter in exchange for just 8 years behind bars. 8 years for the killing of a child. Edmonton police responded with words not often heard from law enforcement in public. They called the plea deal a miscarriage of justice that would bring the administration of justice into disrepute. Interim Chief Warren Dreichel and his executive team signed a letter to Alberta's Assistant Deputy Justice Minister demanding the plea be scrapped and the case be reviewed. Now, they invoked their duty to the victim, to the public, and to the justice itself. And they made it clear, if this deal goes through, they're prepared to release details from the investigation so the public can see exactly why this deal is wrong. Now, that is a bold move, unprecedented in Edmonton Police Service's history, and one that deserves absolute respect because here's the truth. Too often we see cases where victims, especially children, are forgotten while deals are struck to make the system run smoother. The public is told about litigation risk or about managing caseloads. What about the risk to the integrity of justice as we know it and as we demand from it? What about the risk to every Canadian's faith that the life of an 8-year-old child matters more than a quick plea? And the defense lawyers, they're furious at Edmonton Police Service for speaking out, accusing them of overstepping. But the police are right, so who cares? Their job is to investigate. And when they see justice about to be gutted, their duty doesn't end with handing over the file. Their duty is also to stand for the victims. Now, this case, it's about more than one accused and one plea deal. It's about a justice system in Canada that bends over backwards for the accused and forgets that a little girl was murdered and left in a bag. Now, the Edmonton Police Service stood up and said, not this time. They knew they would take heat for it, but they did it anyways, and that should be applauded for putting the rights of victims and the credibility of justice in Canada ahead of politics and process. Because if an 8-year-old child's death doesn't demand the full weight of justice, it begs the question of what actually does. And that pushback isn't isolated. Across Ontario, police leaders are saying the quiet part out loud again and again. The system is broken, and their prescription, let's talk about it. When the chiefs of police across Ontario stood up and say flat out that our justice system is broken, you better believe they're not exaggerating. They're sounding the alarm again because the people who deal with violent, repeat offenders every single day know the rest of us are already feeling it. And Canadians are less safe today than we were a decade ago. Now, the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police released a statement this week pointing to a surge in home invasions and violent crimes. And let's be honest, home is supposed to be the safest place we have. When people are getting stabbed in their rooms or shot in their driveways by offenders who are out on bail, something has gone deeply wrong. And we already know what it is. It's crystal clear. But here's the chief's messages in plain terms. We need a justice system with teeth, not one where bail is handed out like candy, not one where kids manipulated by gangs get a free pass under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, and not one where convicted violent offenders keep walking out of jail to reoffend. They're calling for real reform, bail reform specifically, corrections reform, sentencing with meaningful consequences, and resources for police, courts, and corrections so that bail conditions can actually be enforced. Now, they pointed out right to the core of the problem. The balance is off. Reasonable bail is a charter right, yes, but the safety of Canadians has to carry equal weight. Right now, it doesn't, and the chiefs are blunt. Repeat violent offenders know the system is weak, and they use that weakness to their advantage. They even noted that the Youth Criminal Justice Act is being exploited by organized crime groups who push teenagers into committing adult crimes like murder because they know the YCGA shields them. Now, the chiefs also talked about mandatory minimums for repeat violent offenders. That's not being tough on crime for headlines. It's about ensuring there are real, predictable consequences for people who keep terrorizing families, because without certainty, there's no deterrence. And without deterrence, communities keep getting victimized. Now, this isn't just rhetoric, all right? Police leaders say it plainly. Canadians cannot accept a situation where violent repeat offenders are routinely granted parole. And for those of you watching at home, how many more times do you want to hear about something terrible only to see this be the case? And let's applaud them for finally putting it in writing. For too long, chiefs and frontline officers have been expected to stay quiet while politicians push catch and release policies under Bill C-75. Now, Ontario's top law enforcement leaders are united in saying that Canadians have known for years the justice system is failing the very people it's supposed to protect. And now the question is now whether Ottawa will listen or whether it keeps prioritizing the rights of repeat offenders over the safety of law-abiding families. Now, when you hear a system with teeth, it sounds abstract until a convicted sex offender cuts off a GPS and vanishes. And sadly, we've seen this in multiple stories throughout the country where a really bad person is left with a GPS vehicle monitor and they come back and they do something horrible. And York Legion is living that reality right now. Now, imagine this for a second here. A convicted sex offender guilty of exploiting a minor, by the way, just disappears into the wind after cutting off his GPS ankle monitor. It's just a monitor around his foot that he can cut off. Now, that's not hypothetical. That's happening, and it actually happened in Ontario. York Regional Police are asking for the public's help in finding a 27-year-old Chengwin Chad Lee. He was convicted back in May of obtaining sexual services from a minor, breaching release conditions. Surprise, surprise, he was out on bail, and mischief. Instead of being held, he was allowed to stay in the community under electronic monitoring while he waited to be sentenced. So convicted, waiting to be sentenced, here's your ankle monitor. And on July 22nd, police say he simply cut off the device and just vanished. Since then, the courts have sentenced Lee to 5 years in prison, but here's the problem. He's not in prison. He's on the run, and police don't know where he is. Now, they've warned that anyone helping him could face criminal charges, and they've even encouraged him to turn himself in, but let's be blunt again. How often does this happen? This isn't an isolated failure. And just a few months earlier, out in Edmonton, another man accused of sexual offense involving a minor also removed his GPS monitor and disappeared. And law enforcement sources estimate there could be as many as 600 missing foreign criminal offenders currently living freely in Canada after dodging the justice system. 600. Now that's not oversight, that's a collapse. Now think about the victims in these cases. In Lee's case, the child was exploited. That child's family now watches the news knowing that the man who preyed on their daughter, who was convicted, sentenced to 5 years in prison, and is yet still to be found and be put behind bars. Now, that's trauma stacked on trauma. And for the community, for the country, every parent is left asking, what's the point of a conviction if offenders can just walk away? This is where the public's frustration boils over. We have GPS technology that can be cut off with a pair of scissors. We have courts that keep releasing repeat violent offenders under Bill C-75, so-called principle of restraint. And we have police scrambling to clean up the mess after offenders disappear, all while telling the public to keep their eyes peeled. Now here's the hard truth. Until Canada treats breaches like these with immediate and serious consequences, the message and the stories with offenders is simple. Cut it off, run, and roll the dice. And the message to victims that their safety, your safety, my safety, and their pain takes a backseat once again to high-risk offenders instead of protecting us. Now, York Police deserve credit for going public and sounding the alarm, but Canadians deserve more than warnings after the fact. They deserve a justice system that keeps convicted predators exactly where they belong, locked up, not loose in our communities. And while some offenders run, other offenders in plain sight continue to commit crime. And this takes us back to downtown Vancouver at 6 a.m. where a woman was attacked on her way to work. Now picture this, it's 6 o'clock in the morning in downtown Vancouver. People are heading to work, grabbing coffee, starting their day. And a woman walking near West Pender and Beatty Street is suddenly attacked by a naked man on top of a parked car. Now police say the suspect, a man in his 20s, jumped down, started yelling, charged at the 31-year-old woman, knocked her to the ground, and then humiliated her even further by urinating on her. Now, strangers, luckily, stepped in the street, and they stepped in and restrained him until the police arrived. Now, imagine being that victim, blindsided, assaulted, degraded, and left traumatized in front of bystanders. The suspect was arrested and then taken to the hospital under the Mental Health Act, which is where he may have a variety of issues and there needs to be a psychiatric assessment. Now, he's still in secure custody, but police have not released his name and they haven't confirmed his criminal history. And instead of saying they'll be forwarding a report to the Crown Council to see if charges are laid, they're not doing it. They're just putting him into the hospital. Now, Constable Tanya Vicentin called the incident very disgusting and very unfortunate. And while those words are true, they don't capture the full reality. A young woman alone on her morning walk was victimized in one of Canada's busiest cities, while the rest of us are left asking how something this vile can happen so casually in broad daylight. Now, the real issue here is bigger than one man's behavior. Canadians are watching as assaults, random attacks, and violent mental health crises spill into all of our streets. Just look back at Barrie. And too often, suspects are shielded by privacy rules, shuffled into hospital custody, or released back into the street days later. And victims, they're left carrying the trauma again. They're the ones who pay the price while the public is told it's under investigation. And this is where the justice system again keeps losing trust, because people want to know, will this man face serious criminal charges, or will this be chalked up to another unfortunate incident brushed aside by mental health defenses and a system more interested in managing offenders than protecting women on our streets? Now, let's not forget the bystanders who stepped in did what was right, but they also did what too many Canadians are being forced to do: protect one another because the system can't or won't. Now, that should be the job of our laws, our courts, and our law enforcement, not random strangers forced to intervene against a naked man attacking a woman at sunrise. At the center of this story is the victim, a woman who was simply trying to walk to work where she needed to be. Now, she deserves more than to be labeled as part of a disgusting incident. She deserves justice, and so do the rest of us who are tired of seeing our streets turned into stages for crimes that should have never happened in the first place. Now, Canadians see this and ask, why target the law-abiding when streets feel less safe? Then Prime Minister calls the gun grab voluntary. Now let's clear up that fog as we wrap up this episode of the Crime Report. The Prime Minister of Canada just called his own government's gun confiscation a plan voluntarily. Yeah, you heard it. He said it was voluntary. After 5 years of telling Canadians this was mandatory, after billions budgeted to force people to surrender their legally purchased property, Mark Carney now says it's optional and opportunity. In an interview, Carney said, "This is not about confiscation, this is about voluntary return of firearms for compensation." But that directly contradicts what his own public safety minister, Gary Anandasangari, said just weeks ago, that enforcement would not be voluntary, that people would have no choice but to hand over firearms banned under 2020's cabinet order. So which is it? Canadians aren't stupid. They know these so-called buyback bans by more than 2,500 models of firearms, most of them hunting rifles and sport shooting firearms that were legal for decades. Licensed gun owners bought them lawfully, were screened by the RCMP, and passed safety training. Now, they face the threat of criminal charges and up to 5 years in prison if they keep them. That's not voluntary, FYI, that's confiscation. Now, Rod Giltaca from the Canadian Coalition for Firearm Rights called Carney out, saying flatly, there were no assault weapons banned. Every one of these firearms was for hunting or sport shooting. That's why they were legal in the first place. The lies are outrageous. Tracy Wilson from the CCFR said it even plainer. This isn't an opportunity, it's a confiscation under threat of imprisonment. Meanwhile, provinces like Alberta have already said they won't allow their police or sheriffs to participate in seizing firearms. And that matters because the Liberals know most guns used in crimes aren't coming from legal owners. Mark Carney said it himself after a homicide in Hamilton. They're smuggled across the US border. Toronto Police Association President Clayton Campbell said it bluntly, "I can't think of a time where a legal gun has been used in a crime in this city, not one. Nor can I, being a former Toronto police officer." Now, polls show most Canadians agree. 55% want Ottawa to crack down on smuggling, while just 28% support buybacks. Yet, this government continues to pour billions into a program that targets law-abiding citizens while violent gang members walk the streets with illegal handguns and rifles trafficked from the United States. Now, Carney's flip-flop only fuels more confusion. Is this really about public safety, or is it, as Giltaca pulled that out, cold, cynical politics aimed at punishing Canadians who are unlikely to vote Liberal? Because while Ottawa plays games with definitions, taxpayers are on the hook for a program expected to cost nearly $2 billion. And let's not lose sight of what matters most. Communities across Canada are facing rising violent crime, shootings and home invasions, crimes committed by repeat violent offenders already out on bail. Instead of fixing bail, instead of securing the border, the Liberals are focused on the safest, most vetted group in this country, licensed gun owners. Now that is not in the interest of public safety. That's politics dressed up as policy. And Canadians know the difference. Now, on this episode, you heard the pattern, not just the headlines. A political killing watched around the world. A convicted offender with a loaded prohibited Glock getting deep discounts in court. A federal government pouring billions into the gun grab while cutting the RCMP. An 8-year-old boy shot in his own bed. Families and survivors demanding change as Parliament debates jail not bail. A convicted predator allegedly gaming corrections while a toddler recovers. A Canadian city forced to declare a state of emergency over encampments. Edmonton police breaking the precedent to stop an 8-year-old's death from being bargained down. Chiefs of police saying the system is broken. A convicted sex offender cuts off a GPS and vanishes. And a woman attacked at sunrise in downtown Vancouver, while the rest of us ask why this keeps happening. Now, different places, same story. And a justice system that too often protects offenders first and communities last. Look, if we want safe streets, we need clear lines. Bail with teeth, sentencing that means what they say, borders that are enforced, and policies that target criminals, not the law-abiding. Victims first, public safety first. Now, if you value straight talk and fact-based reporting, help us keep this going. Visit junonews.com/Ron to sign up, subscribe, and save 20% off of your subscription. When you support independent journalism, you make this show possible and you make it harder for anyone to look away. For the Crime Report, I'm Ron Chinzer. Stay safe, look out for each other, and we'll see you next time.